Okay, great. Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us tonight. My name is Tessa, and I'll be presenting my team's project, which is evaluating climate resiliency in coastal cities. So by now, we're all familiar with the effects of our warming planet. Record droughts, unrelenting wildfires, and devastating hurricanes are being felt right now across the globe. Climate change is being felt particularly hard at our coasts, where dense urban centers are facing the threat of storm surge, erosion, ocean acidification and warming, and then sea level rise. And as the climate changes, these threats intensify. For example, not only do we know that sea levels are rising, there's also evidence that the rate of sea level rise is rapidly accelerating. In the past century, sea levels have risen an average of 8 inches globally. However, by the end of this century, scientists predict that rise could be as high as 3 feet. Based on current population growth, nearly 6 billion people will live within 120 miles of a coastline in the next 5 years. And not everyone living in these coastal cities will be privileged enough to have somewhere else to go when disaster strikes. It's the low-income communities of color who are most vulnerable to the forces of climate change, and as such need to be recognized as high-priority populations for effective and just resilient strategies other than just migration. And yet, in the face of all of these daunting challenges, coastal cities around the world are best positioned to act as exemplars of climate adaptation. So that brings us to our client. The Urban Ocean Lab is a coastal resiliency think tank that supports climate policy and ocean health solutions for coastal cities. The Urban Ocean Lab is creating a coastal resilience toolkit, and this semester they've asked us to provide a foundational research base for that toolkit that focuses on nature-based solutions. To do this, we developed a methodology to identify and evaluate coastal resilience initiatives and then conducted in-depth case studies to showcase how the US is adapting to climate change at our coasts. So before I launch into our research though, I just want to first acknowledge the inherent tension between nature-based solutions and man-made infrastructure. Man-made infrastructure such as seawalls can certainly be an effective way to protect the coastline, and they have the advantage of being an immediate solution to the climate crisis. New York City right now is planning to build a $1.4 billion seawall in Lower Manhattan. And yet there are debates over if this truly is the most practical or equitable solution. The Urban Ocean Lab asked us not to include man-made solutions in our project scope because they don't consider them to be the most responsible strategies for all people or for the environment. Maintaining the original ecosystem health is incredibly important to our client, and these walls tend to sever the connection between the coast and the water. They think that there are better ways to invest for longer-term resilience, such as with nature-based solutions. These solutions might take longer to develop, but they provide many lasting benefits. They can buffer strong waves while still providing that critical habitat for wildlife. And they also create a more gentle slope from the land to water that allows for natural sediment migration to occur over time. They can take many forms, including living shorelines and coral reefs, as well as sand dunes and beaches, and then mangrove forests and wetlands, just to name a few. And these solutions not only promote ecosystem health, but they also act as valuable carbon sinks. So with this in mind, we began our research by first defining coastal resilience. We then divided our team into 3 research work streams to make sure that we were approaching the issue from every angle. In these work streams, we oversaw a thorough literature review and conducted informational interviews with subject matter experts. Throughout the semester, we spoke to more than 20 experts from various fields around the country. Speaking to professionals helped inform our research and ensure that we're focusing on things of regional importance. Their guidance helped us to create one of our first deliverables, which was a grading criteria with which to evaluate and identify various coastal resilience initiatives. Our criteria was founded on 3 work streams, which were ecology, governance, and equity. We then identified key themes within each work stream shown on the screen here. We researched existing databases and indexes to try and measure the success of various initiatives in meeting these themes that we identified. Then using this criteria as a guiding reference, we evaluated a lot of locations and ultimately selected 6 places to conduct final case study results. And those ended up being 3 major cities of New York, San Diego, and Miami, as well as 3 wider regions of Chesapeake Bay in Virginia, the Gulf of Mexico, and the North Carolina Outer Banks region. We felt this mix of big cities with less urban regions that still have cities in them and significant populations best represented a range of solutions at different levels, whether that be local, city, state, or interstate partnerships. We then spent the rest of the semester conducting a deep dive into the many ways that all 6 are tackling this issue. And while I don't have time to share most of those results, I'll just share 2 specific examples. So let's start with New York City. It's the most populous city in the United States, and it's also a global hotspot for sea level rise. In 2012, Hurricane Sandy cost an estimated $19 billion in destruction, displacing thousands of New Yorkers. This disaster shows how important it is for New York to embrace coastal resilient solutions that could mitigate future hurricane damages. Our highlight from our New York research is the Billion Oyster Eco Restoration Project. New York Harbor was once home to over 200,000 acres of oyster reefs, and it took less than 100 years for the whole population to be wiped out. Today, the Billion Oyster Project is working to restore these vital ecosystems and bring native oysters back to New York. Oyster reefs provide habitat for hundreds of species and promote water filtration, but most importantly, studies have shown that they act as a natural defense against large waves, and this reduces flooding and prevents erosion. This project is currently working in dozens of sites along the city coast, ranging from Coney Island to the tip of the Bronx, to install mesh bags of oysters below the waterline. Since 2014, the project has restored 47 million live oysters, 1.6 million pounds of reef, and has engaged 6,000 plus local students in installation efforts. And again, this is just one project of many that we included in our New York case study. And this isn't to say that this particular project is a gold standard that should replace the Manhattan seawall, because most likely these projects will all need to work together to prepare New York City for climate change. Rather, this one project just highlights an example of a nature-based solution that met our grading criteria as well as the urban ocean labs. It clearly promotes ecological health, it is supported by New York governance, and it achieves equity through educational community programs. The next region we want to showcase is the North Carolina Outer Banks. The coastal zone of North Carolina is vulnerable to flooding and rising sea levels, but most notably, the coastline suffers from extreme erosion due to overdevelopment. The initiative we want to highlight is a joint project between the North Carolina Coastal Federation, which is a state level NGO, and the Natural Resources Conservation Service, which is a USDA agency. This project is taking 5,000 acres of coastal farmland and restoring it to its previous wetland state by purchasing tracts of unused farm directly from small farmers. This project is an example of how local, statewide, and national institutions can cooperate to foster the development of a more ecologically sound coastal environment while uplifting the often neglected agricultural community. This project tackles the surrounding area outside of North Carolina's major urban hubs, but it indirectly improves resiliency along the coast and impacting those cities. And again, this is just one of many solutions that we looked at for our North Carolina Outer Banks case study. So as we conducted our analysis, we faced a few challenges. The first challenge was to define a city. And by that, I mean how to include coastal initiatives that are happening outside cities, but still benefiting them. Ultimately, this challenge led us to expand our scope to not just look at cities, but include those 3 regional case studies that I mentioned. We also had to figure out how to evaluate the efficacy of projects that are relatively new and so they don't have conclusive data yet. In the end, we decided to include these projects in our research as we think they're important to get a holistic idea of current solutions. And then our greatest challenge was how to take all of our research from completely different regions to form one cohesive narrative. Having our 3 pillars of ecology, governance, and equity to guide us through and kind of ground us throughout was very helpful to unite these projects and structure our final report. Ultimately, we hope that the research that we're handing to the Urban Ocean Lab will inform their toolkit and be used by coastal cities around the world as a framework to guide and inform best practices. Climate change is here, and its impacts will continue to affect the billions of people who live on the coast. However, we hope that the findings we've shown here tonight leave you in a place of optimism. It will take hard work to prevent the worst of a climate crisis, but that work has already begun, and it's being led by coastal cities around the world. So I'd like to thank our entire team on their hard work this semester, and I will now open the floor to questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tessa. Opening the floor for questions. Give folks a second to collect their thoughts. Okay, I believe we have a question from Professor Charles Guzman.
Hi, thank you, Tessa. That was great. I want to ask you to reflect on 2 things. Obviously, you guys have put together this toolkit that you didn't have full time to explain all the different case studies. I'm wondering if you can just share a couple of the other highlights that we may have missed before. So specifically, can you talk to us a little bit about a case where we are actually helping with sea level rise, right? So like a case where, so the oysters is great. It doesn't help with sea level rise. It helps us with other things like wave attenuation. So is there a best in class example that you included in the toolkit of a strategy that helps specifically with sea level rise for cities? And then second part of my question is, can you also share if it's an instance that you think is a best in practice for governance? So which we heard a little bit less about in your presentation. What's a city that is doing a great job at that? Thank you.
Yes, so let me just kind of think back on all of the, we've done so many different projects. So I want to think for, specifically for sea level rise, a lot of restoration work that's being done in San Diego on their wetlands. Kind of the general, like, kind of the way that we were looking at our nature-based solutions is that by dealing with storm surge, there, like as the sea levels are rising, of course, that's impacting the kind of indirect impacts like storm surge and erosion and all these other things because the sea level is approaching the coast more often. And so I think a lot of the things that we were looking at are more like kind of general restoration of these environments that mitigate, kind of less so impacting, not like stopping sea level from rising, but really trying to help mitigate the impacts of the indirect effects of sea level rise, such as the fact that as sea levels rise, hurricanes have a higher launching point to fall out on to make landfall onto the shore. So how can you mitigate hurricane damage as a result of the sea level rise? So that's kind of more of like an indirect way that we address that. But I think most of the work that we did with like eco restoration examples were more along those lines. And then I'm trying to think for a good example of a governance project. I mean, a lot of our projects kind of were all related. So like the example of the farmland that I talked about for Outer Banks, North Carolina, a lot of that's possible based on like different working government agencies together that allow, like a lot of the political will is there in these areas to advise these projects. I personally really liked a project that we looked at for San Diego in which they were using government collected census data to inform best practices and decisions on which most vulnerable communities that were being impacted by climate impacts. And so they were using the census data to really inform where they should localize these different strategies to adapt the environment. So that was one that I thought was a good one for using specific kind of like government collected data. And again, we're going to have all of our various studies in our final report, and I would encourage everyone to look at that to kind of see the more in-depth like details for each of these various like many projects that we've listed, because they're all very cool.
Thank you, Tessa. That's great.